All the speakers are going to open up the session with a 5-minute talk. We decided we'd keep it brief to begin with so that we can have a more animated session as we go along. I'm going to give the two who just spoke a rest and start with Ragita Dirgam, an old friend of mine from the Middle East, and she has been commenting for El Hayat on Arab-American relations for how many decades? Many. And asked her to start. And then next, I'm going to ask Julian Pequet, who covers Congress for the Al Monitor, an online newspaper that really does a very good job in covering the Arab world. And perhaps he can help explain to us the congressional attitude in the case of JASTA, which is, I'm hoping he will talk about. And then we have Yara Bayoumi, who is with Reuters here in Washington, but has just come back from the Gulf, Dubai, and the Reuters Bureau in Dubai. And I'm sure she is quite well acquainted with how the Arab countries out there feel about the United States and its policy. But let's start with Ragita.
Thank you, David. I hope the organizers will help us a little bit by really pressing on those outside the hall to kindly speak outside the doors rather than at the expense of this very important conversation we should have, because between the dishes and the outdoor noise, it's very hard. I have been sitting back there at times and I couldn't hear anything. So let me start out by being quite open about this. I feel that we need to say it as it is in some cases in the Arab-American relationship, whether it is amongst the public or between the media. I believe the disconnect continues. I believe there is a deeper distrust. There continues to be a disinterest by the American public in the Arabs' wars, as they call them. And there is dismay by the Arab public, particularly in light of American position vis-à-vis Syria. The media on both sides have not tried enough to address the disillusionment and its consequences. Americans, in terms of the general public, genuinely believe that the raging wars in the Arab region are solely the making of the Arabs and Muslims. So the attitude is, so let them kill each other. At most, attention to the Russian component in the Syrian war is emerging only recently. Hardly is there any mention of the Iranian component in the Syrian war on the side of Bashar al-Assad and with the help of important militias. The Arab general opinion, on the other hand, is accusative and holds American foreign policy responsible for the raging wars, particularly those feeding the sectarian Sunni Shiite divide. From President George W. Bush, a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which helped Iran get rid of two of its most formidable enemies, to the pivot towards the Islamic Republic of Iran by President Barack Obama, American policies towards Arabs have been seen as antagonistic and condescending, no matter how much the GCC states invested in the alliance with the United States. Playing Shiites and Sunnis against each other is viewed by Americans as indigenous, vintage Islamic, and by Arabs as quintessential American policy. Such issues are barely covered in the American media, but they are omnipresent in the Arab media. There is no serious debate on American foreign policies except by a few serious columnists, and I would point out to my dear friend David Ignatius in this regard because I have followed what pain it has been to bring the issues to the forefront of American media, and we have several good columnists. I'm not speaking of David alone, but There are very few and not enough. American television was much more receptive, I must say. David Ottaway mentioned that I've been on American television for decades. Yes, the first time I was on American television was in 1979 with the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. It was Robin McNeil who interviewed me, for those who are old enough to know that. And for for more than 33 years, I've been a fixture on American television, discussing issues of interest, from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to why do they hate us, to the Iraq war, to the war on terror and the rise of Iran. But suddenly, I will tell you, the doors closed. The doors became shut. I'm not sure it's only me, because I have seen few of my Arab colleagues on the screen in comparison to the way it used to be. So I don't know what's going on, whether it's a stifling that is intended or whether somebody said something that was not liked. It could be maybe I said something that led decision makers to say, shut her out. But I don't know. We could discuss that a little later. All I know is that listening to Americans who are of Arab origin, and we are Americans, is useful and beneficiary because it could help bridge the divide, and the other way around. I am thrilled when I see David Ignatius, as mentioned by Adel Toraifi, when his column is translated, and in our competitor, Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, because it's important to read him in Arabic, for the Arabs to read him, and so to read such a sober and responsible opinion. I myself, my column is published in Al-Haya. I am the bureau chief of Al-Haya in New York, and my Friday column is translated and published in the Huffington Post and in arabiyaenglish.com.net, so, and it gets carried by newspapers throughout the world. All I want to say is that we need more of that. We need to share the conversation so that we can expand it and take it forward. We need to go back to the essence of mutual respect, and that is listening well to what the other has to say while reserving the right to differ. We have a big job ahead. The thing that I worry about is not only the need for resuming American leadership in the world, it is the necessity that Americans continue to claim the higher moral ground globally. That is what I really would like to have back. This privilege has eroded and has been seriously jeopardized by turning a blind eye on the crimes, and whether they are war crimes or crimes against humanity, in particular in Syria. It's not becoming for the United States of America to look away when such atrocities are committed, whether by ISIS or by the Russian planes. It is such important matters that matter, and that's what we in the media should be putting forward, so that a new debate can hopefully instill some sense rather than the prevailing, raging madness everywhere. Thank you very much.
Julian, if you don't mind, the minister has to leave shortly, so maybe we should let him speak before he leaves.
And many of you need to know that this is not an ordinary Minister of Information and Culture. If you look carefully at your program booklet, you will see that he is an inner circle member of the inner circle on political and security issues on one hand, and economic and development issues on the other. You can't get more central in terms of jugular, vital challenges and issues and needs and concerns than those.
Again, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure and an opportunity, actually. I once stood here or sat here as an audience, one of the audience, listening and learning from these sessions, and I hope to provide some this time. I think plenty has been mentioned today, and plenty of questions have been mentioned. But I would like to address maybe an issue which I think is very important to focus on, which is perhaps the cultural transformation in Saudi Arabia, one issue which is paramount to me. And the other one is the media coverage as well. We tend to, I've worked, and I'm a veteran of the media as well, like Raghida. So we worked in different media institutions, and we realize and understand how it's difficult sometimes to deliver a message or actually portray a situation that is happening somewhere around the world. These days, it's very difficult for journalists to travel to places like Yemen, for example. It's very difficult for them to travel to places like Libya, Syria, Iraq, who suffers? The leaders, actually, because we're writing something about places and about people and about situations that we have not been there to examine by ourselves. And one of the reasons for that is the continuation and the growth of terrorism that has hit even amongst its victims, the journalists. If you count the number of journalists who have tried to go and report from difficult situations, you would count a number of them. I lost like one or two of my friends, one in Syria and another one in Iraq. They were just trying to report on those issues. The other thing on the matter of coverage is that we always tend to cover the sensational stuff. But the thing or the things which are important to the people are less covered, which makes me sometimes unhappy, because I see, with every reporter coming to the Saudi Arabia or other places, I understand the situation. They have like 3 days or 4 days to leave. His editors, provided him very little to attend, and he goes there and he needs a story, and definitely he needs to have a sensational story to justify the budget that he took for the trip. It's different somehow from journalism of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, where a journalist would go to a place, live there for a year or 2 or 4, and report from there continuously. Now you have less reporters who are stationed in different countries. And I think this has affected even our way of assessing the situations in different countries. And you don't get it right. I remember as an editor, it was very difficult to write some stories or accept some stories or articles without knowing exactly what happened down there. And sometimes you would hear some conflicting stories about what happened. So that's on the media coverage. The other part is on the cultural transformation. We have embarked on a very important cultural initiatives in Saudi Arabia. We with David have spoke just briefly about it, but it's part of our vision of how to transform Saudi Arabia in a country where arts are not celebrated as they used to be or they should be. You have people feeling less about humanity, about common things that drive people together. And this is why I think that pressing on the arts and the arts initiatives, we spoke about the establishment of the Royal Complex of Arts. that would include all the forms of arts that we know, modern and folklore as well. And we also are embarking on developing a media city. One of the problems I think that I have seen, at least in the media, especially in the Arab media, is the content. You don't have Arab content. Arab content is very little, and when you have it, it's mostly drama, and it's mostly about dysfunctional families or dysfunctional situations. Therefore, one of the goals that we have set is to build a media city. And the goal behind it is actually to enable young women and men in Saudi to be able to be directors, actors, and to be able to deliver content in Arabic that represents ourselves, and that can be a guide, and that can be something that the younger generation can look up to and see and understand from. At the moment, we have a lack of content, and therefore you have an audience which is not your own. You have a young generation who can be very easily persuaded or affected or pushed into the hands of extremism just because you don't have the tools and you don't have the content suitable enough to provide them. I think that's enough for me to say at the moment. Thank you.
Since the minister is leaving, I'm grabbing and taking the opportunity. I have three questions for him before he leaves. I'll read them all, and you can answer the ones you want. When will the media in Saudi Arabia support the freedom of opinion in both TV production and journalism? Why does it take so long for a foreign journalist to get a visa to Saudi Arabia? Why is it that Saudi newspapers don't carry sensitive news and agreements, and Saudis read about it in the outside sources?
Okay. If you allow me to see them, not to forget the questions.
Sure.
One by one. For the first one, about the media, one of the things that we faced was the freedom of expression. And if you say the freedom of expression, you need to put a standard for it. Like the freedom of expression according to whom, and to which country, to which culture, to which history. And in Saudi Arabia, we have freedom of expression to some extent, and we would like to increase it to more. But one freedom of expression that they already have is to criticize the Minister of Culture. Okay, so that I guarantee for you that's happening every day. It's always, I'll let you in on something that happens every Monday when we go to the cabinet. I'm always late entering the cabinet just to be away from my fellow ministers. And why? Because somebody would have complained about them or wrote something about them in the newspaper, and I had to answer to them. So I'm always on the side of the journalists because I was a former journalist. Therefore, expanding it and actually showing it. And I think one of our problems is that we didn't have a way to show exactly how the press works in Saudi Arabia. Everybody thought that the press was controlled in Saudi Arabia. Well, if you think it's controlled, you can help me out in that. But nevertheless, we have more than 3 initiatives that are focused on improving the image of Saudi press to the outside world, and as well, one of them I'm going to speak about, which is the second one. Why foreign journalists take so long to, well, very easily. We have 4 months which are very hot in Saudi Arabia, okay? So a lot of journalists would like to come from August, I think, and then you have Ramadan. Very few also journalists would like to come in Ramadan. So you have a few months when the government is functioning. But our problem here is more electronic and modernizing, and it's not about rejecting journalists. Actually, we had more than 30 journalists, foreign journalists, just at the border going to Yemen a week ago. Imagine the number. And once we have the media city established and running, we're inviting newspapers and TVs and foreign media to actually be stationed in Saudi Arabia, better than sending somebody for a single visa. What's the other thing about some agreements? This I didn't understand this question.
I think it was, why do Saudi newspapers don't carry sensitive news? And the Saudis have to find out about it from outside sources.
Well, from my side, I would say the opposite. They always carry sensitive news and sometimes incorrect news. I don't want to be, but that's the nature, I think, of journalism. Sometimes you get the story right, sometimes you get it wrong, and sometimes you're provided with the information, and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you can get to the source, and sometimes you don't. What we have tried to do in one of our initiatives is called, I don't recall the name at the moment, but is actually to provide a center, a centralized center within the Saudi press agency to answer all the questions regarding anything that is related to politics or economics or sensitive issues or agreements that any journalist, whether is a Saudi or a non-Saudi, to be answered. I know that sometimes as a journalist, somebody would not answer you in a certain ministry or a certain agency, but it's our job in the near future to make that reversible. So we're allowing the system to say that, if you don't have a comment from the ministry or the agency, then we can answer the question for you. It's our responsibility to answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we wish you success. Julia? Julian's going to explain to us Congress.
Got a congressman along with me. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Anthony and the National Council for the invitation. Like Dr. Ottaway said, I'm the congressional correspondent for Al-Monitor, the U.S. news site dedicated to bringing the region's perspective to Washington and beyond. So I'll focus my opening remarks on Congress. You've already heard plenty today about U.S. Gulf relations. As President Obama would say, it's complicated. I don't want to belabor that point, but it's important to understand that this isn't only the president's opinion. And I want to play for you a post-9/11 bill interview that captures sentiments on both sides of the aisle. This is pretty short.
I've got significant concerns about their relationship with.
I think you can hear this.
Right.
You hear it?
I mean, they made a deal with the devil.
No. All right. Well, all right. If you can't hear it, I'll just read it to you. I mean, this is Senator Corker, Senate Foreign Relations Chairman. Really briefly, what he's saying, I've got some significant concerns about their relation with Wahhabists, right? I mean, they made a deal with the devil years ago, and now they're inextricably at present linked to that and tied to that. That's of great concern, I think, to most every person in this body, so they know they have issues to deal with. They more than know that. So hopefully something good is going to come out of this. He's talking about the overwhelming Senate vote in favor of overturning the president's veto on the 9/11 bill. Now, Corker is about as sympathetic to the Saudi point of view as folks get on Capitol Hill. Probably many of you know that. He's a harsh critic of Obama's unenforced red line in Syria. He voted against the Iran deal. And he is leading the effort to rewrite the JASTA bill, despite voting for it in the first place. But his remarks hint at a black hole at the heart of U.S.-Arab relations 15 years after 9/11. The bilateral relationship has long focused on shared interests rather than shared values. And with the U.S. public souring on U.S. interventionism, you can expect efforts to disentangle America from the region to go on long after Obama leaves office. Consider that just a week before the JASTA vote, 27 senators voted to prevent what should have been a routine billion-dollar tank sale to Riyadh because of fears the U.S. is getting dragged into another bloody quagmire, this time in Yemen. Now, even the arms deal's most fervent supporters, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, hardly mentioned U.S.-Saudi ties during that debate. They framed instead the issue around the Houthis being Persian puppets that need to be stopped. And don't think for a minute that Congress is done with Yemen either. Any latent sympathy for the Houthis died the minute they shot missiles at the USS Mason earlier this month. But you can bet Congress will press the White House to clarify its strategy in Yemen when they return from recess. I wouldn't get my hopes up too high, but the Washington establishment is going to start clamoring for intervention in Syria anytime soon either. Right now, everyone is talking about all these think tank reports that are coming out. I'm sure a lot of you have read them, calling for renewed U.S. leadership in the region. Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta's Center for American Progress wants a no-fly zone to ground Syrian warplanes. I wouldn't bet the farm on it. Hillary Clinton herself, may have endorsed the idea during the last presidential debate, but only, she said, after a lot of negotiation. But no amount of negotiation is going to get Russia on board. As for Donald Trump, he's flatly said that confronting Russia in Syria would lead to World War III. In Iraq, both parties are equally reluctant to engage more U.S. troops to defeat Daesh or keep the peace afterwards. Beyond platitudes about boosting support for the Kurds, America's boots on the ground and Washington's narrow worldview, Democrats and Republicans are keen to let the region sort out its problems on its own. On Iran, remember that the pro-nuclear deal Jewish lobby J Street endorsed more than half the Democrats running for House seats this time around. That's the first time in their history. The House will likely vote right after the election to renew snapback sanctions on Iran's energy sector if Tehran cheats on the deal, but that's the extent of bipartisan agreement right now. And even that bill may have trouble clearing the Senate. Nor is either candidate expected to make a big push to relaunch Israel-Palestinian peace talks in the short term. As for the fallout from the Arab Spring, it's basically back to business as usual with Egypt, Bahrain, and others. The U.S. will largely look the other way on human rights violations in exchange for stable governance, at least until the next social explosion again throws the whole relationship into upheaval. I'd like to end this on a positive note, so let's talk about one of the few places where the U.S.-Arab relationship is flourishing right now. Without a single lobbyist on its payroll, tiny Tunisia has managed to double the amount of aid it gets from the U.S. over the past couple of years. The Jasmine Revolution, as they call it, is a cause célèbre for Washington's human rights lobby, and that's clearly paying dividends. So I'd like to end on that note. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here today. So, as David said, I arrived in DC about 6 months ago. And one of the main things that I couldn't really get my head around was really the absence of nuance and big picture whenever the topic of the Middle East and its relationship with the US came up. The conventional narrative for the last couple of years at least was, in 2011, President Obama turned his back on traditional allies. And in the quest for the nuclear deal with Iran, it meant that President Obama turned his back on his Gulf allies and turned a blind eye to what is considered, what a lot of Gulf allies consider to be Iran's malign behavior in the region. And that's really where the debate has been stuck for the last few years. And I'd say that the media has a big part to play in that. In many cases, we haven't really been able to drive or move the debate forward from that. And that's due to a couple of reasons. Sometimes we generally need a simple narrative or a simple arc to frame a story. But that often ends up being quite narrow, which means that much of the nuance is lost. a big part of that also obviously has to do with the changing landscape of the media that we're in now. When you have traditional newspapers with fewer resources for foreign news, the focus is often on urgent conflict reporting. And when we're competing with more media outlets than ever before, the focus is always on how, a story that is stark, that is more definitive than others. So, just as an example, 2 days ago, a colleague of mine had told me she was going to Dubai. And I said, oh, that's great. Please bring me back some Batil dates, which if some of you here know are just really great dates that you can get in Dubai. She then told me, and I'm picking up from where the minister left off, where he said that the media was different in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But this is in the late 90s, where she wrote a story about just the date industry in the Gulf. And I remember thinking, as I read the story when she sent it to me, it would be very difficult to see a story like that being written now. It's a nice-to-have story. It sheds a bit of light about an industry we don't really know very much about, but it's not focused on conflict right now, which is where most of the resources are focused on. And that means that because a lot of the focus is on conflict, it means that the audience, and where we are today, the US audience, often only gets a perception of the region which is driven in conflict. And that also permeates in the discourse here that we then see from policymakers on both sides of the spectrum. We heard President Obama saying that Middle East conflicts date back millennia. So the idea being that this is really this is how we're viewing the Middle East. And then of course we have the Republican presidential candidate also talking about how the value of Muslim Americans, for instance, is in what they can bring in reporting on suspicious activities, for instance. And all of that, of course, then gives a very skewed perspective of the region, one that is rooted in threats rather than opportunities. And finally, just one more thing I'd like to add here was on how difficult it is to frame public perception, especially when we are in an atmosphere where we are able to customize the kind of media that we want to read, that we want to absorb, that we want to have around us. And that makes it extremely difficult to change. So I'm sure a lot of you, for instance, in the run-up to the Brexit debate, I had a lot of colleagues and friends who said they deleted anyone on their Facebook wall who was pro or anti whatever position they were on. And that generally means that you're only subjecting yourself to a particular mindset that you want to know, and you're then shielding yourself from the rest of the conversation. So those were a few of the challenges that I wanted to bring up today, and I look forward to discussing them after that. Thank you.
So I'll be brief. The first thing I want to say is what a pleasure it is for me to be here with dear colleagues who I've known since early in my career, Ragida and David Ottaway. These two people represent the best of what my business is about, and it's really an honor for me to be with you. I also love meeting younger journalists. Sometimes I worry that our business is running out of gas. It's like a sputtering car trying to go uphill, and when I see young journalists like Yara working for Reuters, a great news organization, I feel like we have a future in our business, so it's great to be with you. Minister Toraifi said in his conversation with me that he wanted candid conversation about Saudi Arabia and about the Middle East, and so I'm going to try to be as candid as I can. I do think there's something broken in the way in which the media seeks to cover the Arab world, and I think it needs to be fixed. I think the core of the problem is that there isn't enough openness. People talk about it being open to the media, but the media quickly encounter obstacles when they try to report aggressively and directly. They find themselves banned from a country. They find their work under attack.
And I honestly think that the problems of this part of the world that I grew to love 35 years ago will not get significantly better until there is a more open dialogue. Part of what makes this crazy country that we're in now work is that, we have nightmarish arguments. We're living through one of them. But there is still a way to keep talking to each other. So that's my first wish. When I started covering the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal in 1980, it was possible to go everywhere. It seems strange that in that period there was more opportunity to have access, but if you were in Beirut and you were in West Beirut, in Hamra, and you wanted to go to see the Kataib in East Beirut, you crossed the Green Line. You had to slunk down pretty low in the car sometimes when the green zone line was for real, but you were able to do that. I have stashed away in my desk press passes from every Lebanese militia, which were they're comical to take out some of these pictures. But the point is that in those days, people wanted coverage. They wanted to tell their story to us, whether you were Yasser Arafat or whether you were Walid Jumblat or Nabi Berri or anybody really in the Middle East. In those days, I think, wanted to tell their story. And that led to a kind of openness, and people had to tolerate that sometimes the stories we told were not going to be the ones that they would have wanted, but they wanted us to come back. They wanted to have access to the international communications chain that we represented. Today, they don't feel that they need us. And they feel that they can communicate directly through ministries, through Twitter accounts, through controlled media channels. And so people from independent news organizations have greater difficulty. I have written that I feel we live in an embedded world where you're supposed to embed with an army or a political party or a government and tell the story from their side, or you won't get access. And I hate living in this embedded world. I think that being unembedded, moving back and forth across the green zone, metaphorically, moving among all the different sides, having that implicit white flag that says, I'm a journalist, I don't have a side here, I'm not embedded. That's the way that this works. And we've gotten very far from it. We live in a world, as I said, where people think they can communicate the message directly. And in some ways, that's wonderful. That's the world of social media, where yesterday, last few days, I wanted to know what was going on in the battle for Mosul. I've been in Iraq twice this year, but I can't go there now and see that battle unfold. But I can go to hashtag Mosul, and I can see all the video that's been posted in the last 24 or 48 hours from courageous reporters and just citizens who were there, who were watching, who were recording the images of battle and conflict. Some of the scenes as people retook their villages around Mosul, the joy in their faces as they were liberated from the Daesh occupation, tell you an important part of the story. So that's wonderful. The communication directly through social media, through what's put up every day, every minute on Twitter, I wouldn't want to change. The problem is that it's so subject to manipulation. When we live in a hashtag world, we live in a world that says hashtag Mosul and hashtag hate Mosul. We live in a world where the streams of communication are divided between the different hashtags, perspectives, armies. So that's the world that we've ended up in. I love social media and the openness it gives us, but the way it reinforces polarization and division frightens me. So I want to close with this thought. I'm going to take my former editor, Adel Toraifi, but really take all of my Saudi and Middle East friends at their word when they say they want more coverage. They want us to see the Middle East whole, to open a broader debate. I mean, I thought that Justin said something really important when he warned us that Bob Corker, arguably the person in the U.S. Senate who's most sympathetic to the Saudi viewpoint, ended up voting for JASTA, a position that Saudi Arabia is so upset about. There's a message there that you have to take seriously. But so I want to take people up on that offer. Keep traveling, keep listening, keep interviewing, being respectful of the people that I talk to, but also trying to ask them questions that I know my readers want me to ask. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, David. Speaking of Beirut, I remember those days when we started at the Commodore Hotel. We went through various militia with our press pass up to the Israeli Press Center in the outskirts of Beirut, and then went back all the way through this, all the militia and back to the Commodore to write our stories. I mean, will we ever be able to do that again? I wanted to ask a couple questions to start things going. I'm concerned, or I want to know what people think about whether something is fundamentally changing in the congressional and U.S. attitude towards the Arab world, and that JASTA, it really was quite an eye-opener, I think, to all of us. Does this signal that something fundamental is changing in how Americans think about the Arab world, and not just Saudi Arabia? Who would like to? Regida?
Is this on? Is this on? Yeah, it's on. Yeah, I think in recent history, I think there has been a de facto freezing of Arabs in the frame of 9/11. I think 9/11 has really colored the thoughts of Americans as to who are those who hurt us. They are Arabs. They don't call them Muslims. It is not the frame of Muslims as such. I think it's more Arabs, because they were from they were Arabs. But there was no graduation out of that. Prior to this, I think the Arabs have been frozen in the frame of Arab-Israeli conflict. And it was always presented that the aggressors are Arabs. It was never really put forward that, yeah, at times Israel was an aggressor as well, and there's something called occupation, which is a violation of human rights, at least. But so then you had this inherent problem with Arabs. Then you had terrorism coming through, whether it's in the one that George W. Bush wanted to wage a war against, the war against terror in Iraq, and then the hatred of that war itself also reflected on those bloody Arabs. We have to fight their wars, and we are dragged into their wars, let them kill each other. So I don't think there has been a real address of that relationship. I know we like each other. I mean, I see you and remembering you and David, remembering your days in Beirut, and with pleasure. I know Beirut is not the typical Arab city. I know there has been much more freedom there, but there is affinity. There is, when you go there and you mix, especially with us Lebanese, because I'd like to say something nice about us, other than we kill each other. But really, there is no problem culturally. What I want to say, it's been a political argument. It's been the issue of what the Arabs are thinking Americans are doing, and as far as the foreign policy, particularly it was Israel at one point, and now, like I said in my opening remarks, turning a blind eye on what's happening in Syria. But also, I think that from the American point of view, it has been, the public in general has been led to believe that, Israel is a little country in that neighborhood where these monsters are all Arabs. That's where it started. Then came 9/11, and then here we are still suffering from that.
Anybody else like to comment?
Well, listen, sure, I'll go ahead. Is this on? Yeah. So I think if there's a silver lining with JASTA, it's that it's brought all this to light. I mean, in my mind, JASTA is like the Armenian genocide bill, you know? If it's going to reach the floor, it was always going to pass. And so you had these lobbyists, et cetera, working to prevent that from happening. And for whatever reason, you know, now the leadership, McConnell and McCarthy, have decided to put it on the floor because there has been so much pressure from the families. But the underlying support, in my mind anyway, was really always there. I mean, this should not come as a surprise that it passed once it hit the floor. And so I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, this is years, decades of perspectives from lawmakers, you know, that have to get reelected every 2 years and are very close to the feelings of their electors. And so this is not particularly surprising.
Do you think JASTA will be revised?
I do, but every time, I mean, I've tried to write follow-up stories to this, looking at it from the Saudi perspective, and every time I talk to any of these lawmakers, they are only concerned about how can we rewrite it so that the potential hit on U.S. troops, for example, is mitigated. They never talk to you about the Saudi relationship. That's peripheral to them. It's all about, you know, we just passed this thing that could really hurt our troops, could hurt our foreign policy writ large, but in terms of the Saudi relationship, that is not what is driving any potential rewrite of JASTA.
John?
Yes, David, I think Regatta's correct, and so is Julian. And you could take it back to the 30s with the Sheikh of Arabiya and Rudolph Valentino, etc. Right straight through to today, where Arabs are seen as those, as them, as other. And even though there are 22 Arabs, and we're talking about Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad, to Berbera, Algiers, to Aden, Aleppo, and Alexandria in between, there's no real distinguishing between and amongst them. I sat in with a meeting with Paul Ryan and a congressman several years ago in Qatar, and the Qatar emir was asking the congressman, can you not distinguish between us Qataris, who had nothing to do with 9/11, and one of our neighbors who that did? And the congressman said, well, you're asking too much, Emir. That's a bridge too far. At Dulles Airport and JFK, when they slam Arabs up against the wall, they don't give a damn whether it's a Moroccan or Qatari or Lebanese or Saudi Arabian. If it's an Arab, it's an Arab. Go after them. It's those, it's them. They did this, quote unquote, to us. So yes, Regatta's put her finger on something that's getting worse, not better. And that's part of the idea behind the Arab Cultural Institute that would distinguish between and amongst all the many contributions that have been positive to civilization, humanity, and from which America's derived no end of benefit.
Yara?
I would just add like a really small point on the issue of resources again and how that plays into that. You know, JASTA, there are a lot of countries, including most of Saudi Arabia's Arab allies, who have voiced their objection to JASTA as well. But you don't really see that really covered in mainstream US media either, because at this point it's the secondary story and it's no longer the primary story of here's what Congress passed, here are the difficulties with it, now we move on to like what comes next. So again, the complete narrative is always lost when we're reporting on that story, and that also again helps to cement the already negative perceptions that are out there.
I just want to say something very one-liner on JASTA. I honestly think, and maybe my Saudi friends will be angry with me now, I think it's also a reflection of either a failed diplomacy or failed attention. I think it's amazing to see the result of the vote on JASTA, knowing that at least I expect that the Saudi embassy, I'm told it's at least 200 persons, it should be if it's not, and that there are people who are supposed to be doing the lobby. To have that vote is probably a lack of attention or taking too much for granted or a failure, straightforward. It shouldn't have happened. And that is a lesson that should be learned. And I think JASTA will be amended, but a new approach, a new way to look at it should be adopted by all the lawmakers and by the Saudis alike.
David?
I just wanted to add a brief comment, and at the risk of saying something that will be seen as too critical, I wrote that it would have made an enormous difference in the psychology of that vote. I don't know if the vote would have turned out any differently. If a prominent Saudi official had, in a way that was meaningful for Americans, expressed the deep concern that Saudi Arabia feels about terrorism. Saudi Arabia has suffered from terrorism. Saudi Arabia, I know from many conversations, people in the kingdom feel remorse about the rise of al-Qaeda, about not having seen things in time. And I think in terms of our debate, that kind of statement from someone from the kingdom would have been really a good thing. Because I think it would have been part of the kind of honest dialogue that people need. If people down the road see a Saudi Arabia that's changing in the ways that Adel al-Toraifi said, and the Deputy Crown Prince has discussed, a country that has a moderating dialogue with Islam, a country that has theaters and art galleries and a sense of cultural life and dynamism and economic growth for its citizens. There's no way that the media is going to stop people from seeing that, or that won't make a difference. You know, those real changes are going to get through to the American public. And, you know, a world in which JASTA doesn't pass is a world in which people see those things and they respect the country that's doing them. So again, since our theme is trying to be open, honest, and candid, I felt I needed to say that. I deeply regret the vote. I think it was a terrible mistake. But I do wish, because I wish JASTA had not passed, that there'd been a little more dialogue, a little more of what I just described.
Have a question here from the audience. Why is the media against Egypt? Always sees the bad and forget to report on the accomplishments. There is a double standard to cover the news. Would someone like to?
This is, I suppose it's addressed to the American media. I should let my colleagues answer that. But you know, I think that in general, there has been much more sympathy with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to power by the Western media and particularly the American media, because they thought this is democracy. And this is how they looked at it, that, you know, it's their turn to get to rule, and they stopped at that rather than scrutinizing what was the project of the Muslim Brotherhood and how were they performing and how many promises did they make and how many did they betray and how many did they deliver on. I think there was laziness and this automatic sort of like, that's it, Muslim brothers have been dealt a bad blow, which is not correct. And that's why lots of Egyptians are angry. This is not to say that the era of Mr. Sisi is now flourishing with democracy. No, it's a long way before he can prove that he's done the right job. But I think many Egyptians have been, at least a great number of them, those who went to the streets and have decided that, yes, they'd like to put a stop to this project of Muslim Brotherhood. They feel they've been betrayed by the embrace, an American embrace of that project.
I'll say it at Reuters, speaking for Reuters, we have a very big presence in Cairo, And it's one of the stories that we always strive to report in as many facets as possible. And we always strive to be balanced and a reflection of the sentiment that is out there on the streets in Cairo, and also reflecting the sentiments and the point of view of the government when the stories dictate that. But I will say that, as David said, sometimes there are countries where we are reporting in where we don't have as much freedom, where we also don't get an answer always from the other side to questions that the media has as well. And so, I think every reporter will tell you the worst thing we like to include in a story is no comment from someone, because we feel that that is a disservice, that it doesn't reflect enough of what that side wants to portray. But we do run into that in many cases.
David messaged me he has to go write a column. But I have a question about one of your columns, so maybe before you go you can answer. In your article from October 25th, you addressed the issue of the U.S. seduction and abandonment of proxy groups in Syria, the YPG in particular. How do you see this phenomenon playing out at the state actor level? I think state to state? I don't quite know. In other words, are we going to abandon states as well as non-state actors?
I wrote in a column yesterday that was cited that one of the least endearing characteristics of the United States is that it asks people to take risks and make sacrifices on behalf of the United States, and then when the going gets difficult, it too often abandons them. I think that is sadly a recurring story for our country, and it's one I very much wish we could change. I think it's part of our problem today in Iraq. I think Iraqis believed that we meant it when we said we were going to stand up tribal militias, when we were going to be there to support them if they challenged extremists. And so I think there's a deep sense of unhappiness when we don't stick around and they're left often at great risk. So I just would close this. Again, I'm so pleased to be asked to be a part of this event and have a chance to talk with all of you. I think it's really important that the United States not make promises that it can't keep and end up frustrating our friends around the world. We need to be very careful not to overpromise, not to draw red lines that we're not prepared to enforce. But when a president of the United States makes a commitment on behalf of the country, people really need to be confident that that's for real. And I think when you think about the next president, whoever that is, you try to think what's the challenge for that person. It's to rebuild the credibility of our assurances to others that when we say something, we mean it, and we're going to carry it out.
John, you want a closing comment?
I second that. To say what one means and mean what one says. When we speak about the democratic process and respect there for it, and we are seen in the United Nations Security Council as the Olympic champion of anti-democratic behavior, where we've used the veto 76 times, 41 times, when the vote would otherwise have been 15-0, or it is 14-1, and the United States vetoes the 14, and therefore aborts the democratic process. Or in January 2006, when in the free, fair, open, transparent elections in Gaza, Hamas won. Jimmy Carter signed off on this, as did nearly 80 others. There. So it's oftentimes there's a physical proximity to a small country at the eastern end of the Mediterranean if it is perceived to be threatened by the democratic process, then we oppose that democratic process. With regard to supporting the Muslim Brotherhood victory in Egypt, no one would admit it, but certainly a number of specialists are not necessarily conspiratorial in believing that a lot of people thought, wow, this will embroil the area in the Gulf, because the Muslim Brothers were implying that they were going to be reaching out to the #1 supporter of terrorism in the Gulf. And many would welcome that because it's deflective, it's distractive, it changes the agenda, it focuses America's attention, national needs, far to the east of the Mediterranean. As far as possible, New Zealand would do.
Anybody else have closing comments?
Yeah, I just would like to say that what I laid out in my opening statement is really about, I was hoping that we'll get the chance to have a conversation about some of the points, particularly when there is a lack of honesty in addressing the issues that are between the Arabs and the United States. For example, yes, indeed, I know I've heard at this conference many people speak about the Iran element. I think it is fantastic that there is an understanding on the nuclear deal that suits the world, suits the United States, though it's like buying 10 years and 10 years only, which is a big price to pay if Iran has been allowed de facto to use this nuclear understanding, nuclear deal to have a free hand in Arab lands. It's very difficult for Americans to understand that why do we object that Iran runs the affairs of Lebanon or of Syria or of Iraq. It is really a very basic notion. It is, these are not Iranian lands. Iran has the right to be a great country within its own borders. It's a historic country, and it is a country that we should live in peace with. But when Iran is fighting on the side of Bashar al-Assad together with the militias and Russia against certain sector of the Syrian people, there are those of us who are going to say they've been given a free hand because, and as a consequence of the nuclear deal. They have been not scrutinized. There have not been, nobody even talks about it in the American media. So for me, I'd like that my colleagues in the American media take a wider look and a deeper look when they are looking about our concerns. Certainly go ahead and fall in love with Iran if you feel like it, but also pay attention as if we point out the pain that's coming our way, because it's real pain, and if you just paper over it, it's going to harm our relationships even more.
Julian?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to go back to what David Ignatius was talking about, and that's the importance of getting the voices from the area, from the region, to speak, openly and honestly, and it's very difficult. And I'll give the example of Al Monitor. I mean, we are dedicated to getting the best and the brightest writers from the region, all perspectives, writing in their native language, translating it into English so everybody here can read it. And I will tell you, I mean, we have writers in Egypt, we have writers in Turkey, very well read. We have writers in Israel, the Palestinian territories. And, for a long time in the Gulf, we had Bruce Riedel of the Brookings Institution, because nobody wants to be out there, unless it's to criticize, the UAE criticizing Qatar or something. But in terms of writing honestly, in depth about their own country, their problems, what's happening, it's just very, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience know that, it's just very, very difficult. And same thing with Egypt. I mean, we get criticized for covering Egypt a certain way. I can tell you, I cover Congress. Everybody in Congress is just running out of patience with Egypt. And just a few months ago, another $100 million went by the wayside because they cannot work with the Egyptians. The Egyptians will not tell them how they're going to get this money to the different aid agencies, et cetera, and it's just a huge headache for people on Capitol Hill, for people in the State Department, and so they just raise up their hands and move the money elsewhere.
Well, thank you, one and all. This has been a not a cheerful discussion. But I think it's been an honest discussion.